There's an idea running through Carl Jung's writings that doesn't get much purchase these days because we think that we've become more sophisticated in our psychological understanding. And that idea is mass psychosis. But I think that we've abandoned that idea a bit too soon, and we ought to reconsider it. There are times in history where it does seem as though something bigger is going on than simply individuals experiencing chemical imbalances, something almost necessarily having to do with historic trends. And we are living through one of those times. I wanted to talk about this through this image of the blue pill and the red pill, because this has become a well-known device used by those who have become illiberal to explain why. There are two pills in this story. The blue pill represents accepting things as normal, accepting authorities like government and media sources, believing things are orderly and that we can go along with it all. The red pill represents the person who chooses to question all that. So, in certain segments of the right, this image has gained a lot of purchase because there's a sense among them that they can't trust existing authorities, whether they're governmental, scientific, or educational. At this point around the world, we see an extraordinary number of groups, theories, and ideas that fall into this category of being red-pilled. These are just some of the examples of things we've seen in the last decade or so, including, of course, right and left-wing populism and various vigilante groups, and most recently QAnon, anti-maskers. One thing that we don't usually associate with all this, but we should, is the growing decrepitude in our society's institutions' ability to serve people. Government, education, even our entertainment tends to be just repeating itself in a sort of somnambulistic walk down memory lane. So when we look at typical responses to all this from people who consider themselves more sane, they tend to aim low or they tend to aim partial, and they say, oh, it's the fault of the internet that's allowed disturbed people who would otherwise be isolated and allowed them to create an expanding echo chamber. To a certain extent, it's true, I'm sure. But they say it's the availability of guns, perhaps, or it's the mainstream media, or it's the right-wing media. Again, to a certain extent, that's probably all true. But then the conclusion seems to be that, well, we just need to get rid of whatever proximal cause is happening. Maybe we need to cancel people who put out certain information, or censor Facebook, or regulate guns more, or if we just get rid of President Trump, or those pesky social justice warriors, or cultural Marxists in universities, and the list goes on and on. The common denominator here is that people like this tend to think if they pinpoint that one bad actor, then all our problems will go away. But these things are symptoms of a disease, not causes, and the extent to which people try to get rid of them or cancel them or censor them, they create more suspicion on the part of people who already think there's a crisis of authority and they can't trust anyone. One thing I do in Chapter 6, which I'll link to below, is to go back to Carl Jung, a figure who's often dismissed these days, partly because he's an old-timey psychologist who wasn't into curing people with psychopharmaceuticals, and partly because he's become associated with New Agers, which is not his fault. But there's a lot more going on in Jung, and what I concentrated on in my book was the political thought that he developed at a time when things were really going off track with the rise of fascism and Nazism in the 1930s, World War II, and the rise of the even larger and deadlier Cold War state. Here's a quote from Jung explaining what he thought were the deeper roots of the mass psychosis of Nazism. He writes, thanks to industrialization, large portions of the population were uprooted and were herded together in large centers. This new form of existence, with its mass psychology and social dependence on the fluctuations of markets and wages, produced an individual who was unstable, insecure, and suggestible. He was aware that his life depended on boards of directors and captains of industry, and he supposed, rightly or wrongly, that they were motivated chiefly by financial interests. He knew that no matter how conscientiously he worked, he could still fall victim at any moment to economic changes that were utterly beyond his control, and there was nothing else for him to rely on. So what Jung points to is this process of urbanization, which happened over centuries but really took a leap in the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution and had led to this incredible disruption in traditional ways of life. It had made this change in the lives of ordinary people where before they had at least been able to eke out their subsistence on land they owned or at least had some control over, as well as perhaps common land, through farming, hunting, fishing, and gathering. And after, they were entirely dependent for their lives on whether or not they could make a money wage. Jung talked about the effect of the sheer numbers of people in growing urban areas, working in collectivizing systems like factories and bureaucracies, how this kind of collectivized work turns people into part of the machinery and creates a dehumanizing herd mentality. He theorized that city dwellers cut off from nature were less likely to have a direct experience with the transcendent, and this experience was necessary to build an inner life so that people would not be as susceptible to the herd mentality. On top of that, Jung noted that the rise of the welfare state occurred necessarily to address the vulnerability that might otherwise cause revolutions to happen. But the price of the welfare state was that people felt even more vulnerable because even more dependent. And then, over time, the economy became more sophisticated and opaque to people, more and more beyond their comprehension and control. But they sensed that they were at the whim of this marketplace they couldn't control. This is what Jung is getting at, this incredible sense of vulnerability, this sense that faceless people and institutions out there that they didn't know literally controlled whether or not they could eat and have a roof over their heads. So, fast forward to today. We see this process right now in the Midwest in the ongoing destruction of rural life. The depopulation of the middle of the country, the loss of small diversified farming and the small businesses that made a living from rural communities. With the loss of diversified farming, even the farmers who are left in charge of these vast consolidated farms cannot provide for the means of subsistence. And you have the great irony of so-called food deserts in small towns where for miles around only corn or some other crop grows. We tend to think of this as normal now. But if you can contemplate how insecure at a gut level people really should feel if they have no immediate means to feed themselves, and they have to rely on far-flung global economics to make it happen, it should indeed make them feel rather vulnerable. So in the wake of this depopulation and weakening of rural areas, the people who are left are often poor, without schools and services that work well, maybe without a weekly church service. Back in the 80s, according to an ag economist I was listening to recently, suicides amongst farmers began to spike. And the reason was that they were losing what they loved, or they were having to buy out their neighbors and become a part of a farming system that took a lot of the joy and skill out of what they were doing, and they were left living on the edge and ever more dependent on government subsidies to make it. Now, if people live at the whim of an uncontrollable, globalized economy and global competitors and government and political powers that push and pull in ways that seem to disregard their welfare, how are they supposed to feel? And how are they supposed to react, especially at a time when fewer and fewer of them are getting a decent education regarding history and political thought, so they don't really know how to frame what's happening to them? We have an awful lot of people working in a dehumanizing way because of increasing automation, even in areas like the checkout counter, where now one person can supervise 8, 10, 12, or more customer-operated machines. Not everyone can retool and be a scientist, technician, or engineer. And so there's that many fewer employees earning a check, or They're churning through other low-paying jobs. And the ones that are left monitoring that checkout lane are not having to think as much, and they're not interacting as much with the people who roll through. This should lead to questions such as, have we given over too much to automation? What is automation for? Should we be able to control it instead of it controlling us? Again, if it's beyond our ability to change this process for the better, is it not understandable that at a certain point people might react to the way that they live and seek for answers beneath the surface so that they can gain back a sense of control? The market is often referred to as the ultimate arbiter of our behavior and choices. But I'd like to suggest that while a free market is still our society's imaginary, it has become less and less a reality as the economic changes I've alluded to have taken place with a great deal of cooperation between government and corporate interests that have made it increasingly hard for entrepreneurs to get a foothold, to compete, and do things their way. The free market imaginary at this point causes confusion. For instance, in this case where the tree huggers or environmentalists are blamed for causing more government regulation, which is getting in the way of the supposedly free market, which would otherwise save these coal miners' jobs. The old narratives and imaginaries are getting in the way of us being able to see that our economies are no longer serving human interests. If we can't see the reality of our situation, then we can't change our situation. Our cultural institutions, such as universities, are dominated by economic interests in ways that perpetuate this lack of perspective. We know the humanities are threatened with extinction in many of our country's universities due to the myopic focus on STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, and on what promises to get students jobs so that they can become a part of the economic machine. And so, we have more and more people not prepared with a knowledge of history, culture, literature, and religion such that they can be effective citizens. And this is really hard not to see at this point, but I think a lot of people still don't see it. We started out talking about the rise of the illiberal right, and the implicit question is, where's the reasonable right? Or more generally, where are the reasonable people? Well, I'll just ask some questions to end this with. Should we be treating people like expendable human capital and allow our institutions that serve to humanize us to continue to disintegrate? Shouldn't government be about supporting human independence and dignity, rural and urban families and communities? Should we care more about respect for place and social stability rather than encouraging constant transience and loss of identity? Should we not be paying our tax dollars for a full liberal education for citizenship rather than simply vocational technical training? I would just make the final suggestion that unless we decide to address the dislocation and alienation I've talked briefly about here, red pills will continue to become inevitable disruptors in our societies, and we will continue to be in danger of what Jung called mass psychosis.